The morning mist clung to Lexington Green like a shroud, masking the 77 colonial militiamen who stood in ragged formation, their muskets gleaming with dew. Captain John Parker's weathered hands trembled, not from fear, but from the consumption that would claim his life within months. Behind him, the Wright Tavern's windows glowed amber in the pre-dawn darkness, where his men had spent their final peaceful hours as British subjects. "Stand your ground," Parker commanded, his voice carrying across the common. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The sound of marching boots echoed through the April morning like distant thunder. 700 British regulars, their red coats a splash of crimson against the gray dawn, approached under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Major B. John Pitcairn rode at the head of the advance guard, his sword glinting as he surveyed the small band of colonists who dared to block the King's Road. Samuel Adams and John Hancock had fled hours earlier, spirited away from Jonas Clark's parsonage by Paul Revere's midnight warning. The British expedition's true purpose, to seize the colonial weapons cache at Concord, remained unknown to most of Parker's men. They knew only that their neighbors in Boston lived under military occupation, and that British troops now marched through their homeland like conquerors. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. British officers shouted conflicting orders. "Disperse! Lay down your arms!" Some militiamen began to drift away, understanding the futility of their position. Others, like 18-year-old Jonathan Harrington, whose house overlooked the green, stood firm despite their wives' tearful pleas from doorways and windows. Then came the moment that would echo through history. A single musket shot cracked the morning silence. To this day, historians debate whether it came from British or colonial ranks. Major Pitcairn later claimed he ordered no firing, while Parker maintained his men held their discipline. But in that instant, the die was cast. The British line erupted in a ragged volley. Smoke billowed across the green as militiamen scattered like startled birds. Jonathan Harrington stumbled, blood spreading across his white shirt, and crawled toward his house before collapsing on his own doorstep. His wife's screams pierced the gunpowder haze. Captain Parker fell wounded, still clutching his musket. 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more wounded, while only 1 British soldier suffered a minor leg wound. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive work, Paul Revere's Ride, published by Oxford University Press, the Lexington encounter lasted mere minutes but transformed 13 colonies into a nation in rebellion. The British regulars reformed their ranks and marched toward Concord, leaving behind a scene that would be remembered not for its military significance, but for its symbolic power. The bodies on Lexington Green represented more than casualties of war. They were martyrs to a cause that had crystallized in the space of a heartbeat. Word of the massacre would spread faster than Pitcairn's column could march, carried by riders who understood they now bore news of revolution rather than resistance. Behind the British ranks, smoke still rose from the green where neighbors and kinsmen had bled. The war for American independence had begun not with grand declarations or strategic planning, but with farmers and shopkeepers who chose to stand against an empire, knowing they might die for the privilege of calling themselves free men. Colonel Francis Smith's 700 regulars pressed westward along the Bay Road, their scarlet uniforms now dust-covered and sweat-stained. The April sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing a countryside that seemed eerily empty. Yet Smith, a veteran of European campaigns, felt eyes watching from every copse and farmhouse. His men marched in column formation, their brass buttons catching the sunlight, but their earlier confidence had evaporated with the gunpowder smoke at Lexington. The alarm system that Paul Revere and William Dawes had triggered worked with devastating efficiency. Church bells rang across Massachusetts and signal fires blazed from hilltops. Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had completed Revere's mission after the silversmith's capture, had reached Concord before dawn with news of the British advance. By the time Smith's column approached the town, colonial militiamen were converging from every direction. Captain David Brown of Concord's militia company watched the British approach from his vantage point near the North Bridge. Unlike the hasty assembly at Lexington, the colonial response here showed organization and purpose. Companies from Lincoln, Bedford, Acton, and surrounding towns had answered the call, swelling the ranks to nearly 400 men. They carried a mixture of weapons, hunting rifles, fowling pieces, and military muskets, but their determination was uniform. Major John Buttrick commanded the colonial forces with quiet authority, a local man who knew every stone wall and woodland path. He understood that Concord offered tactical advantages that Lexington had lacked. The Concord River wound through the town like a protective moat, crossed by only 2 bridges. If the British wanted to search for weapons, they would have to divide their forces. The British entered Concord around 8 in the morning, their fifes playing and colors flying. Lieutenant Colonel Smith established his headquarters at Wright Tavern, the same establishment where colonial leaders had met in secret just weeks before. He ordered Captain Lawrence Parsons to take 6 companies across the North Bridge to search Colonel James Barrett's farm, suspected of hiding cannon and gunpowder. The irony was not lost on observant colonists. Many of the weapons the British sought had been moved days earlier, hidden in fields and forests throughout the countryside. What remained were mostly legal arms belonging to the town militia, stored openly in accordance with colonial law. Yet the British search proceeded with methodical thoroughness, soldiers breaking open barrels and dumping flour into the mill pond, mistaking it for gunpowder. As Parsons' detachment crossed the North Bridge, the colonial militia withdrew to Punkatasset Hill, maintaining visual contact while staying beyond musket range. The sight of British soldiers searching their neighbors' homes and destroying property stirred anger that had been simmering since the Boston Massacre 5 years earlier. These were not abstract political grievances. This was violation of their community, their homes, their way of life. Smoke began, rising from the center of town as British soldiers built a bonfire of wooden weapons and military supplies. To the colonists watching from the hill, it appeared their town was being burned. The sight galvanized men who had been wavering between loyalty and rebellion. Adjutant Joseph Hosmer of Concord voiced what many felt. "Will you let them burn the town down?" The decision to advance came not from any single commander, but from collective outrage. The colonial companies formed into column and began their descent toward the North Bridge, their step measured and deliberate. Unlike the confused encounter at Lexington, this movement had purpose and coordination. They were no longer merely protesting, they were fighting back. Captain Walter Laurie commanded the British Guard at the North Bridge with barely 90 men. As the colonial column approached, he faced the same impossible mathematics that had doomed many imperial forces throughout history: too few soldiers to hold too much ground against an aroused population. His orders were to maintain the bridge, but his position was becoming untenable with each passing minute. The stage was set for the war's second engagement, one that would prove far different from the brief tragedy at Lexington Green. The North Bridge spanning the Concord River measured barely 20 feet in length, but it might as well have been the Rubicon. Captain Walter Laurie's 90 British regulars formed a thin line on the Concord side, their muskets loaded and bayonets fixed. Across the water, nearly 400 colonial militiamen advanced in column formation, led by Major John Buttrick and Captain Isaac Davis of Acton. The morning air carried the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of rushing water over the dam. Spring had come early to Massachusetts in 1775, and the countryside displayed nature's renewal even as men prepared for destruction. Davis, a gunsmith by trade, understood weapons better than most soldiers. He had volunteered his company for the dangerous honor of leading the assault, knowing that crossing the narrow bridge would expose them to concentrated British fire. "I haven't a man afraid to go," Davis had declared when Buttrick called for volunteers. Behind him marched 30 Acton militiamen, their faces set with grim determination. These were neighbors who had shared harvests and raised barns together, now united in a cause that would either free them or see them hanged as traitors. The British had made a crucial tactical error. Instead of destroying the bridge or establishing a strong defensive position, they had stationed themselves too close to the crossing. Captain Laurie's men found themselves crowded together, unable to form proper firing lines. When some soldiers began removing planks from the bridge, colonial shouts of protest echoed across the water. The destruction of the bridge would trap Captain Parsons' detachment on the far side, but it would also prevent any British retreat. As the colonial column approached the bridge, Laurie made his final mistake. He ordered his men to form street firing formation, a technique designed for urban combat that compressed his force into an even smaller target area. The first rank would fire, then fall back through the rear ranks to reload. But the narrow bridge approaches made such maneuvers nearly impossible. Major Buttrick raised his sword as the leading colonial companies reached the bridge. "March, boys, but don't fire unless they fire first." The order echoed the same restraint Captain Parker had shown at Lexington, but this time the colonists advanced rather than stood their ground. Their boots thundered on the wooden planks as they crossed the river that had become a boundary between empire and revolution. The British fired first, a scattered volley that killed Captain Davis instantly and mortally wounded Abner Hosmer of Concord. Davis fell at the western end of the bridge, his blood soaking into the very planks his men had built in peacetime. The sight of their captain's death transformed the Acton Company from citizen soldiers into warriors seeking vengeance. "Fire! For God's sake, fire!" Buttrick commanded, and the colonial front ranks delivered a devastating return volley. Unlike the British street firing, the colonists had room to maneuver and could bring their full firepower to bear. 3 British soldiers fell dead, including 2 officers. Several others were wounded, and the morale of Laurie's command shattered like glass. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but those minutes marked a fundamental shift in the colonial rebellion. At Lexington, British regulars had fired on dispersing militiamen. At North Bridge, colonial forces had stood their ground, delivered effective fire, and forced British troops to retreat. The myth of British military invincibility, already damaged by wilderness fighting in the French and Indian War, suffered another blow on a small wooden bridge in Massachusetts. Captain Laurie ordered his men to fall back to the town center, abandoning the bridge and leaving their dead behind. The sight of red-coated regulars in full retreat sent shockwaves through both armies. British soldiers who had begun the day confident in their superiority now questioned whether these colonial farmers might actually know how to fight. Colonial militiamen who had harbored doubts about opposing the king's troops now realized they could not only resist, but prevail. The colonists secured the bridge but did not pursue. Their victory had been defensive, aimed at protecting their community rather than destroying the enemy. Yet in that restraint lay a profound statement about the nature of their rebellion. They sought not conquest, but recognition of their rights as Englishmen. By noon, the countryside around Concord swarmed with colonial militiamen like a disturbed hornet's nest. Companies from Chelmsford, Westford, Littleton, and Groton streamed toward the sound of gunfire, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. What had begun as a British punitive expedition to seize weapons was rapidly becoming a strategic disaster, as Colonel Francis Smith found himself outnumbered 3-1 in hostile territory. Captain Lawrence Parsons' detachment returned from Colonel Barrett's farm empty-handed and shaken. They had found few weapons, most having been moved or hidden, but had encountered something more disturbing: an organized colonial intelligence network that knew their every movement. Farmers plowing fields had vanished when the British approached, only to reappear behind stone walls with muskets. Women hanging laundry had transformed into signals intelligence, hanging sheets in patterns that conveyed information to distant observers. The psychological impact on British morale was severe. These soldiers had trained for European warfare, where armies met in open fields under established rules of engagement. Instead, they faced an enemy that melted into the landscape only to reappear where least expected. Every barn might hide a sniper, every stone wall might conceal a company of militia. The very familiarity of the New England countryside, so similar to rural England, made its sudden hostility more unsettling. Dr. Joseph Warren's intelligence network, established months earlier, functioned with remarkable efficiency. Riders carried word of British movements faster than the column could march, allowing colonial forces to concentrate at advantageous positions. The Committee of Safety's preparations, long dismissed by British officials as amateur dramatics, now revealed their professional competence. These colonists had studied military tactics, established supply lines, and created communication systems that rivaled anything in the British Army. Colonel Smith faced a commander's worst nightmare: mission failure in enemy territory with dwindling options. His men had found minimal weapons, suffered casualties, and were now surrounded by an increasingly hostile population. The return march to Boston, 18 miles through countryside alive with enemies, promised to be a gauntlet that might destroy his entire force. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Smith ordered the retreat to begin. The British column formed on the Lexington road, their earlier martial confidence replaced by grim determination to survive. They had entered Concord as conquerors. They would leave as fugitives. The transformation reflected broader changes in the colonial relationship with Britain. Subjects had become enemies, and the empire faced its first serious challenge in North America since the French and Indian War. As detailed in Richard Ketchum's authoritative account, Decisive Day, The Battle for Bunker Hill, published by Doubleday, the British retreat from Concord marked the moment when colonial resistance evolved into organized warfare. The march would test both armies in ways neither had anticipated, revealing strengths and weaknesses that would shape the coming conflict. The colonial forces shadowing the British column represented something new in American military history. Not professional soldiers or traditional militia, but citizen warriors fighting to defend their communities. They carried personal grievances as well as political principles, memories of the Boston Massacre, resentment over the intolerable acts, and now the fresh outrage of their neighbors' blood spilled on Lexington Green and Concord's North Bridge. British officers noticed the change in colonial behavior immediately. Unlike European peasants, who typically fled from military forces, these New Englanders advanced toward danger. They showed individual initiative while maintaining unit cohesion, combining the advantages of irregular warfare with disciplined fire control. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to enjoy fighting, their war whoops and cheers echoing across the countryside as they harassed the retreating column. The hornet's nest had indeed been disturbed, and its swarm would pursue the invaders all the way back to Boston. The British retreat from Concord began as an orderly withdrawal, but quickly degenerated into a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. Colonel Francis Smith's column of 700 regulars faced an enemy that materialized from every stone wall, barn, and patch of woodland. The colonial militiamen had transformed familiar terrain into a deadly maze where each bend in the road might bring a fresh volley of musket fire. The first serious engagement erupted at Merriam's Corner, where the road crossed a small stream. Captain Nathan Barrett's company of Concord militia, reinforced by men from Reading and Billerica, had positioned themselves behind walls and trees overlooking the narrow bridge. As the British column bunched together to cross the bottleneck, the colonists delivered a punishing crossfire that dropped several regulars and wounded others. British training proved inadequate for this type of warfare. European tactics emphasized linear formations and disciplined volleys, but stone walls and scattered woodlands negated these advantages. When officers ordered their men to charge colonial positions, the militiamen simply melted away through familiar paths, only to reappear 50 yards away. The British found themselves fighting shadows, their superior discipline useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the traditional manner. The heat of the April afternoon added to the soldiers' misery. Their heavy wool uniforms, designed for European climates, became sweat-soaked furnaces as they struggled along dusty roads. Many men had marched 20 miles already, and the return journey promised 18 more through increasingly hostile territory. Water was scarce, and stopping to drink from streams exposed them to sniper fire from concealed colonial marksmen. Captain Walter Laurie, already shaken by his defeat at North Bridge, found his company targeted repeatedly by militiamen who recognized his role in the morning's fighting. Personal animosity mixed with tactical objectives as colonists sought revenge for their fallen neighbors. The warfare was becoming intimate and vicious, neighbor fighting neighbor with a hatred that surprised both sides with its intensity. The British column stretched over a quarter-mile, making coordination nearly impossible. Officers rode up and down the line trying to maintain order, but their visibility made them prime targets for colonial snipers. Lieutenant Edward Gould of the King's Own Regiment fell wounded near Lincoln, and several sergeants were killed trying to rally their men. The famous British discipline that had conquered India and dominated European battlefields began to fray under the relentless pressure. Colonial tactics evolved during the running battle. Instead of massed formations, small groups of militiamen, used the terrain to maximum advantage. A dozen men behind a stone wall could pin down an entire British company, then disappear before flanking forces could reach them. The colonists' intimate knowledge of every path, wall, and hiding place gave them insurmountable advantages that no amount of professional training could overcome. The most devastating attack came at the bloody angle near Lincoln, where the road made a sharp turn through dense woods. Companies from Sudbury, Framingham, and other towns had positioned themselves in a semicircle around the bend, creating a killing zone that claimed dozens of British casualties. The regulars stumbled over their own wounded while struggling to return fire at nearly invisible enemies. Major John Pitcairn, hero of countless battles in the Caribbean, found his horse shot from under him and barely escaped capture by pursuing militiamen. The sight of the famous officer unhorsed and fleeing on foot provided powerful propaganda for the colonial cause. If Pitcairn could be humbled by Massachusetts farmers, perhaps the entire British army was vulnerable. By late afternoon, Smith's retreat had become a rout. His men ran rather than marched, abandoning wounded comrades and throwing away equipment to move faster. The colonials pressed their advantage ruthlessly, showing none of the restraint they had displayed earlier in the day. This was no longer a political protest, but a war for survival, and mercy seemed a luxury neither side could afford. The British column might have been annihilated entirely, but for an unexpected salvation approaching from the east, Lord Hugh Percy's relief force, marching hard from Boston with fresh troops and artillery. The boom of a 6-pound cannon echoed across the Massachusetts countryside like the voice of divine intervention. Lord Hugh Percy's relief column had arrived at Lexington, just as Colonel Francis Smith's shattered force stumbled into view, pursued by hundreds of vengeful militiamen. The British regulars, their red coats torn and blood-stained, their faces blackened with gunpowder and exhaustion, collapsed behind Percy's protective line like drowning men reaching shore. Percy had marched from Boston with 16 companies of infantry, 2 artillery pieces, and a supply train, nearly 1,000 fresh troops to reinforce Smith's battered survivors. The timing was providential. Another hour of pursuit might have seen the entire expedition destroyed or captured. Yet even Percy, one of Britain's most capable field commanders, was stunned by the ferocity of colonial resistance his relief force had encountered along the route from Boston. The British artillery proved decisive in breaking the colonial encirclement. Grapeshot scattered militiamen who had grown bold in their pursuit, and the thunder of cannon fire reminded everyone that this remained a contest between irregulars and professional soldiers. Yet the colonists adapted quickly, using the respite to reorganize their scattered companies and establish new positions along the remaining route to Boston. Dr. Joseph Warren had arrived to help coordinate the colonial pursuit, bringing with him companies from Brookline, Roxbury, and Cambridge. His presence transformed the disparate militia units into something approaching an organized army. Warren's medical training served him well in battlefield command. He understood both human anatomy and human psychology, knowing where and how to apply pressure for maximum effect. The combined British force resumed its retreat toward Boston at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the character of the fighting had changed. Percy's fresh troops provided flank guards and rear guard protection, while his artillery discouraged massed colonial attacks. The running battle continued, but the desperate panic that had characterized Smith's earlier retreat gave way to more conventional military procedures. The colonists paid a price for their earlier success. Many militiamen had exhausted their ammunition during the pursuit from Concord, and powder shortages forced some companies to withdraw from the fighting. Others had been on their feet since before dawn and could no longer maintain the pace required for effective harassment. The initial advantages of local knowledge and surprise were diminishing as the British adapted to colonial tactics. Yet the psychological damage to British prestige proved irreversible. Percy's own letters, later published in London newspapers, described colonial marksmen who could hit a man at 200 yards, and militia companies that maneuvered with all the skill of veteran troops. These were not the descriptions of colonial amateurs that British propaganda had promoted for years. The fighting continued through Cambridge and into Charlestown, where the British took refuge under the guns of HMS Somerset. The sight of Royal Navy warships providing sanctuary for a defeated army completed the transformation of British perceptions about colonial military capabilities. What had begun as a simple weapon seizure had become a strategic disaster that would resonate throughout the empire. Casualties told the story of the day's fighting with brutal clarity. British losses totaled 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, nearly 40% of the original expedition. Colonial casualties numbered 49 killed and 41 wounded, a remarkably light toll considering the intensity and duration of the fighting. The mathematics of imperial control had shifted decisively in favor of the colonists. King George III would learn of Lexington and Concord 6 weeks later, when captain ships arrived in London carrying news that would shake the British government. The American colonies were no longer in rebellion, they were at war. The shot fired on Lexington Green had indeed been heard around the world, and its echoes would reverberate for 8 long years until another British army surrendered at Yorktown. Battles of April 19, 1775, had transformed 13 separate colonies into a united resistance movement with a common enemy and a shared cause. The American Revolution had begun not with declarations or manifestos, but with farmers and merchants, who chose to fight rather than submit. Their victory proved that free men, defending their homes and liberties, could defeat the world's most powerful military force through courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in their cause.